Hello, and welcome to the next episode of Uncanny Oddities. This time, we're going with seasons. So, I don't really know which season it was, so I just picked season 3 because that sounded like fun. So, this is season 3, episode 1. The total episode is episode 62. I put that in parentheses. And tonight, we will be discussing science and religion and whether or not they can coexist together. And we got good James in the chat tonight with us. Should be a very interesting conversation. So, tonight, I have been through quite the spiritual slash religious journey throughout my life. And, not to get too deep into it, but basically, my grandparents, they always went to church and they were, big church people. And you know how it is when you're a kid, you have to do what your parents say. So they used to make me go to church when I was younger, but when I got a little bit older, they didn't make me go to church. They were kind enough to allow me to choose my own path in life. And so I became an atheist. And I didn't really believe in religion for a very long time, and I just cared about science. And, part of that was because some religious people at the time had been very cruel to me because I came out and said I was atheist. And at the time, I thought I was just, announcing my beliefs to my friends at the time on social media. But of course, social media being social media, regardless of any personal beliefs of anyone involved at the time, just the way that social media works, a lot of people were, let's just say, not very nice to me. And they essentially, long story short, a lot of people told me I was going to go burn in hell. And, I lost a lot of friends. Hello, Carter Cornwell. Welcome to the chat. Good to see a new person in here tonight. Thank you for joining. Um, so, with all that going on, I became a bit of a militant atheist, to be completely honest with everybody. And, I did some stuff, not really going to go into details on all that, but, wasn't exactly the nicest person to people. And a few years ago, I met some. James says religious people are cruel, but Jesus wasn't. I like that. That's a good way of putting it. So a few years ago, I started making some more, religious friends that were actually kind to me and treated me with respect, despite me being an atheist. They didn't just tell me I was going to burn in hell. They were kind to me and they treated me with respect. Like Rob, the host, one of the other hosts, the one who started all this, and James in here in the chat over here. So I've started to appreciate, that they were kind to me and they didn't treat me with the same disrespect that many other religious people had, done with me in the past. So I chose to take their beliefs a little more seriously. And over the last year or so, I have started looking into religion and studying it a little bit more and, with an open mind without the intent of mocking it so much. And so what ended up happening is I started looking into religion, and over time, I discovered if you go deep enough into religion, it leads you to science. And if you study science for long enough, it can lead you back to religion. See, a lot of people act like religion and science are enemies, and in many ways they are. But I believe through deep studying and resonance through both religion and science, I believe they can actually intermingle and find a good way to coexist. and it was put very succinctly in a book in something I was listening to on Spotify earlier. I can't remember what it was right now, but someone said that um in religion, there's one thing religion can do that science can never hold a candle to, and that is the deep spiritual faith of belief. And that was really beautiful to me because, science is all about facts and, you study and what is, it just is, and you know that it is because science says so. Wait a minute. That sounds kind of similar to religion, doesn't it? It is what it is because God says so. So, in a way, science might be considered a false idol by some religious people. And I'm going off the top of my head, and I'm starting to realize that how science could be considered a false idol because everything that science does, you're basically replacing God with science. So I can understand how that might upset some religious people. But at the same time, science unknowingly has actually told itself about religion. See, there's this thing that in science called the Higgs particle, aka the God particle, because they found something even smaller than an atom. They used to believe that the atom was the building block of life, the smallest thing. And then they found something even smaller, which was this Higgs particle. And so they called it the God particle because it was where everything originated from. And since looking into religion and science to coexist, here's something else that started to strike me. Um, Here's something else that started to strike me, when I started to think about it was when I started to look into these different religions, you know, there were many similarities. Whether you say God, Allah, Jeshua, Yahweh, all these different names, they all seem to speak of the same archetype, the same character within all these different stories. They had slightly different variations, but at the core root, it all seemed to be the same person. Like Hercules was just the Greek version of Jesus, Zeus was the Greek version of God, etc., etc. You get the idea. And here's what really struck me was if you're talking about, this same creature, this same entity, whether you call it God, Zeus, Allah, or whatever else you decide to call it in your particular religion, they all shared similar stories of the same thing happening, like the flood. Like, for example, in Christian, you know, I don't want to say mythology, but in the Bible, it talks about um, Noah and him building his ark. But this flood that it speaks of, they have this flood in many different religions and many different cultures across the world. And if it was truly just a story and didn't actually happen, then my question is how do they all get the exact same story just with different names? But how did they all get the same skeletons of the same story unless there was a little bit of truth to it somewhere and some of this stuff actually happened? So, and we have samples, like we have core samples of the earth that prove the flood really did happen. So that's science and religion coexisting together. And then you've got zero, the number zero. I was watching an episode of Young Sheldon, and Billy Sparks was being tutored by Young Sheldon, and he said, "Zero isn't real. Zero is not a real thing, and it does not exist." And at first, Sheldon tried to argue with him, and he said that, Of course, 0 is real. It's a number. It represents nothing. Wait a minute. And then he had the epiphany. And he went to college and he discussed it with his college professors. And he's like, hey, we have a problem. 0 may not exist. And so they did all these, like silly calculations and stuff. They did like a little montage where they did all these silly calculations. And then they came to the conclusion that 0 really did not exist. It's a symbol. 0 is a symbol, and symbols are important. So what it was is they came to this whole conclusion, and I thought about it, and 0 is just another name for God. And in the episode, they formed like this little religion around 0. And I actually took it even further than they did. And I started thinking about it. 0 was here before everything else. 0 will be here after everything else is gone. All numbers originate from 0. You can't have any positive or negative numbers without first having 0, which is absolute. 0 is all powerful. 0 creates all the other numbers. And I started thinking about it, and I kind of casually said it as a joke at first, and I was like, just read the Bible and replace every instance of God with the number 0. It'll still make sense. And it really, like, I started to think about it, and I felt like it did make sense to me. And I'm not trying to offend anyone. It was just this little silly joke that I thought about, And it came back to me once again. Everything, be it science, math, or religion, it all leads back to the same central idea. Yes, James, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. God. And it's very interesting to me, and I've come to some of my own beliefs more recently since studying all these different religions. I found that a lot of these religions kind of intermingle and connect with each other. Like, they might disagree here and there, but a lot of the skeleton, a lot of the framework is very similar. And I thought about it, and I have come to the idea, and I've developed a few different theories. One theory I have is there is a possibility that there is someone in a coma or someone is sleeping and they started to develop, they got lonely. They were here all by themselves in their dream world or whatever, in the coma, and they started to create tulpas. And then those tulpas have been around for so long because it's a never-ending dream in the coma, So the tulpas were around for so long, they started to actually think that they were human. And then they created more tulpas and so on and so forth, so that only one single person here is actually a real person. And that real person is God. Or that's one theory. Another theory I had, after like studying all these different beliefs from all these different religions and, mixing a little bit of science in with it as well, another theory I've had is maybe humanity, like every living creature as a whole, is God, and we're all part of God. Because even in the Bible, it says that God created man in his image and instilled within man a divine spark. So I believe that that divine spark is a small fragment of God. Our soul or our spirit is within, contained, a small fragment of God. And when we, quote unquote, die, I'll get back to that in a second, we return to God, the source of all things. Or in Final Fantasy terms, the life stream, Jehovah, And what's really interesting is if we return to a source, and then we take all the information that we obtained throughout our lifetime and we return it to this original source, what if this original source is God and the Akashic records and they are one and the same? When we die, we return to the source and we transcode all our information back to God. And when a new person is born, a small fragment leaves the source and goes down and, creates life or whatever with a clean slate so that they can learn throughout their life, and then they can bring all their information back to God once again, or the source, and they can return everything together. And there is something in science known as the electric universe theory, which is essentially the belief that we're all just massive vibrations that are occurring quickly enough to become solid, just because everything is vibrating at such a high rate of speed. And that one has always been interesting to me as well. So if you mix that with religion, that actually kind of matches up in my mind, because the frequencies, and this has been scientifically proven, that the human body can tune itself to different frequencies, and we can listen to different frequencies. And if we have certain frequencies in our music, like for example 432 hertz, can cause peace, calmness, and just an inner sense of wholeness. So my theory is there's also a possibility that God could be. Yep, James, how did you know what I was about to say? So yeah, maybe God is a frequency. God might be a frequency. God spoke everything into existence. So yes, it is frequency, as James says in the chat. That's exactly where I was headed. And I've also been thinking a lot about Jesus lately. And don't get me wrong, I do believe that there was a person named Jesus, and I believe that he truly did everything they say he did. But here's my thing. What if Jesus, as we know him, was less about the individual person who just happened to be named Jesus coincidentally? We named him Jesus because that was his name, but it was less about the individual person, and maybe it was more about the personality behind the individual. Because the Holy Trinity, I think I finally understand the Holy Trinity. We have the unknowable God. Sorry, not unknowing, but we have the unknowable God that no mortal or man can ever hope to understand in his or her entirety, above us, as above, so below. And above us is the God that nobody can ever truly understand as a mortal. And the next part is the Holy Spirit. And that is our soul, the divine spark or fragment that God instilled within each individual person. And that is what is instilled into the body of Jesus, the man, to make Jesus, the man, the physical embodiment of God. And that is why he was able to perform all his miracles and everything else he did, not because he was Jesus per se, but because he had the persona of God. Because God had essentially, please don't take this the wrong way, but maybe God, using the Holy Spirit, was able to possess Jesus in order to give him the personality or the archetype with which he lived by. And that's how he knew how to tune his body to the proper, and his mind to the proper resonant frequencies in order to achieve those miracles. And maybe, just maybe, the second coming of Christ is more about, how do I word this? Maybe the second coming of Christ is more about people living up to and trying to embody the lifestyle with which Jesus led his life. Maybe it's more important that living human beings that are alive right here today try to embody the spirit of Jesus, and that's what it was all truly about. James says soul and Holy Spirit are two different things. You get the Holy Spirit when you believe in Jesus. So, are you saying that soul is before you believe in Jesus, just like a normal person, and then Holy Spirit is like an upgraded version once you believe in Jesus? Is that, am I understanding that interpretation correctly? And that's what I'm wondering though, is what if the whole Jesus was more about trying to convince people to live like he did? That's why we have the whole mantra of what would Jesus do, to try and get people to live more like Jesus. And I've become a big fan of alchemy. It's also possible that Jesus may have been an alchemist. And to back up my claims, he spoke in parables, and alchemists often had to obfuscate and use symbolism in their language to protect themselves, because if they said certain things that, went against the standards of the time, they could literally be murdered. Like they could be, you know, burned at the stake, or, hung by a noose, whatever. There was a lot of, crazy stuff going on back then. And just, we didn't have free speech back then. Saying the wrong thing could literally get you in like serious life or death trouble. So they had to be very, very careful about what they said, and they had to use a lot of symbolism and encoded language. And once you unlock that language, oh boy, the world gets very, very interesting once you learn to speak like an alchemist. James says, soul is and will always be yours. The Holy Spirit dwells within your soul and helps you be righteous to the best that you can. Okay. I like that. I like that interpretation. I like that definition, how you worded that. So the Holy Spirit kind of goes within you and helps you be a better person. I can agree with that, and I can understand that. And then let's go back, shift over to some more of the science aspect again. The observer effect. This one is wild because it states that whatever you believe will become your reality. And that is actually based on science, literal science. They had these people go into a room and observe a particle. And it was a controlled experiment. You know how controlled experiments work. No variables are changed. It's the same thing. But here's the crazy thing. Multiple different scientists went into a room all by themselves, an isolated, controlled experiment room, and they took notes on what was happening. And then other scientists would go into the controlled experiment room and take notes on what was happening. And when it was all over, all these different scientists started to compare notes, and they realized something wild. They all saw different things occurring. How does that even make sense? And so that goes, hand in hand with the double slit experiment, which I've talked about at length before. So I'm not, going to get into all the details of that again. But essentially, what it was is the simplest way I can explain it without going on a whole tangent is they would shoot these, particle beams through, like with a laser. And what would happen is if there was nobody looking at it, it would operate normally. But as soon as you looked at it, it would change. Like it would go back in time and make a decision based on knowing that it was being observed. It has been scientifically proven that our very observation changes our very reality. James says this is a well-noted concept in the paranormal and occult. Yes. And I've seen stuff like this before, and it's amazing to me because, as I mentioned, I mentioned the term tulpa earlier. If anyone is not already aware, a tulpa is a Tibetan thought form. Yes, it is a physical creature manifest from your thoughts alone. And you know what else can manifest reality just by looking at it and thinking about it? God. You see what I meant when I said that I thought science and religion could coexist and they kind of intermingle sometimes? There you go. And prayer. Let's go into prayer now. People pray to God for things that they want. There's actually a scientific standard for prayer. It's called the law of attraction. And once again, this has been scientifically proven to be a real thing that actually happens. If you think about, hold on. Sorry. If you think about something, you can pull that object towards you. Ideas, stuff like that. So the law of attraction is basically the scientific version of prayer. And prayer works because science has the law of attraction. So if prayer works for you, it's because of science. And if you don't know about science, maybe that's why the prayer isn't working for you. And vice versa. If you didn't have prayer, then you would have no way to use the science that you've learned. James says, I'm on track, but I need to try to polish it up. And he says, I'm getting very good knowledge. Bravo. Thank you, James. I have been studying quite a bit. And I'm the kind of person where, I just get these random ideas in my head and I go down all the rabbit holes to, fully research and study that idea as much as I can with the amount of time that I have. And there's just so much that, passes between science and religion as you study them more and more and more. Like even Noah's Ark, like I mentioned that earlier. There have been multiple archaeologists that believe they have found signs of Noah's Ark, like up in mountains, like Mount Sinai. There are some archaeologists that believe Noah's Ark may have been in Mount Sinai. And that's another interesting one. But there's just so much that intermingles between the two, and I'm really starting to see that. There's this concept of these beings called the observers, who basically they just watch everything that goes on, and they're they want to protect people, but they're not really supposed to interfere. So they just kind of have to watch and try to gently nudge humanity in the proper direction without directly interfering. Yes, the Watchers. Yes, that's what I'm trying to talk about, James. Thank you. The Watchers. And I believe they're a type of angel, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, James? Because they remind me a lot of the Nephilim, actually. But like the good version of the Nephilim, like where the Nephilim were the bad ones that came down and mated with the humans and, got in a lot of trouble and, taught humans how to go to war and all this stuff. It's like those were the bad guys, right? But the Watchers are the good guys. They're the ones that want to guide humanity on the right path without directly interfering. And the way the Watchers work is, I believe sometimes the Watchers, James says the Watchers were the fallen angels. Okay. And I believe sometimes the Watchers will try to interact with humanity in certain ways and try to speak with them and communicate with them, whether it be through dreams, um, you know, different forms of communication. I I'm really trying to word this in an appropriate way, but not to say that there aren't others, different watchers, James says. Okay. Um People that are schizophrenic or have dissociative identity disorder. I wonder about stuff like that, and like maybe they're communicating with the divine, or maybe they're communicating with angels or something that we don't understand, because I've had this theory for a few years now. You know, as time goes on, creatures evolve, right? They develop new means of communication and new traits and stuff like that. All right? James says they have demons. Okay. That's one way of looking at it. But here's my wondering. Some of them do. I will agree with you, James. Some of them do, but I don't think all of them are demons. I think they're kind of like us. Some of them are good and some of them are evil. So I will concede that some of them are most definitely demons, but I'm still going to debate with you on that and suggest that some of them are good people as well, or good spirits. It just depends on which one is possessing which person. But what I've had this theory for a few years now is, what if all these people that are labeled as insane or crazy and put away from normal society and locked away in the mental institutions, maybe they've actually reached a new level of evolution that we simply don't understand. Maybe they have evolved to a level where we don't understand and we just haven't caught up yet. Like, I really wonder about that, because what is crazy or insane other than a synonym for different or misunderstood? Like, I don't know. I really wonder about this stuff sometimes, because, and I sincerely apologize if this sounds harsh, but but what if um we just don't understand? That's all there is to it. What if all these people that we call crazy are just simply misunderstood? Because I don't know how else to think about it, because some of the stuff that we have done to people in mental institutions in throughout our history, it's just that there are no words. We literally used to shove ice picks into people's brains through their nostrils. And men, husbands, used to take their wives to sanatoriums because they called them crazy and they said they were being all crazy. And here's the thing. I've evaded it long enough. People pray. People say that they talk to God sometimes. And if you believe in the Bible, and James, I know that you read the Bible, so please step in and correct me if I'm saying anything wrong. But I think that people who believe in the Bible believe that God spoke to those people and spoke to those people within their heads. Not out loud, but within their heads. And people pray to God and they speak to God as a voice within their head. So, what's the difference between praying to God or speaking to God and these other voices in people's heads? Yes, if the voices are being violent or, trying to tell you to do bad things, then yes, I agree with James. Some of those voices could be demons. But what if the voices in your head are telling you to be kind, help people, and, you know, be generous, give when you can, care for the needy? What if the voices are telling you to do good things? Who's to say that that wouldn't be the voice of God, Jesus, or an angel? And that's what I am trying to very carefully and politely suggest is, what if some of these people with schizophrenia or dissociative identity disorder, what if we label them as crazy, but some of them are actually communicating with otherworldly entities that we don't fully understand? Be they good or evil, what if they're actually communicating with entities that we don't fully understand? James says, if you look at MK Ultra, the process was to fracture your mind and allow a demon possession as an alternate personality. Ooh, that's an interesting theory. I never thought about it like that. Because they basically put you on drugs, right? And I know a lot of those have some very um wild consequences. Let's say that. And, some of them do make you do terrible, terrible things. And it could also weaken your mind because, I'm still very new to, religious studies, but I have played video games where you get to possess people, if that counts. And in the video games that I've played where you have a possession system of sorts, it usually worked as you had to scare the people and that whatever you wanted to possess, be it a people, animal, whatever, you had to scare them, and once they were scared, it would weaken their mind to make possession easier. And James says you have to alter the conscience to allow for the contact. Okay. Yeah, that's kind of like what I've been taught in the TV show Supernatural. That's one of my, hands down, not one of, it is my favorite TV show of all time. And they had a lot of stuff about demons, angels, and monsters, vampires, werewolves, and everything in between. So they had a lot of stuff, and they had really, really accurate lore. Like even the stuff about vampires and werewolves, they were very, very particular about their lore. Okay? So I do believe that James is right on this one. And I never really considered it that way before. But if it fractured your mind in the ways that they say it did, like, making you so, like, your mind just all over the place, like melting and stuff, that could make it easy for a demon to possess you. And I don't want to say, too much, but we can all see that. I think we can all agree that there are a lot of demons deceiving, lying, and doing far worse to people in our society right now. And I'll just leave it at that. So, these are some of the ways that I believe science and religion can coexist. And James, would you like to say anything else before we leave tonight? I give you the floor if you have any closing statements with us. You've always been a good supporter, and I really appreciate having you around, James. Thank you for always coming through and hanging out with me. All right. So that's all I've got for tonight, and I will see everyone next time. Thank you again, James. And we will be back next week on Thursday for our regular episode. Our new season will be back. James says the spirit of lawlessness is running rampant today. Yes, I completely agree. Thank you, James. We will see you all next time.